All right, let's jump right in, folks. We're doing a deep dive today into this document called Why Orthodoxy, and I gotta say, right off the bat, I was struck by just how honest it is, you know?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's refreshingly candid. The author, they don't shy away from any of the internal tensions within Orthodoxy, right?
Oh.
All the theological debates, the sometimes sticky issues of authority,
Mhm.
they lay it all out there.
It's true. And they even go so far as to compare the church to, get this, a bride, sometimes struggling, sometimes even, unfaithful, but always, always loved and in the end redeemed by Christ. It's a powerful image, right? But it makes you think, does this kind of honesty actually make their argument stronger?
That's such a good question. It definitely sets a different tone, that's for sure. Instead of just presenting this, picture perfect, idealized image of the church, they're acknowledging the human element. And for some people, that might make it, I don't know, more relatable, more believable, maybe.
It feels more grounded, I think, more real. And then they get into this whole idea of the invisible church, right? This concept that like all true believers are part of the true church, regardless of what denomination they belong to.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Popularized by John Calvin, of course, and it really resonates with a lot of people. The idea that an individual can have a very real and personal relationship with Christ, no matter where they go to church, or even if they don't.
But I mean, the author also seems to see it as a bit of a way to avoid actually having to search for the historical church.
Right. Like a sort of like a coping mechanism almost. Because if you accept this idea of the invisible church, then you don't have to wrestle with all those, potentially difficult questions like, okay, so which church actually most closely reflects the teachings of Christ and the apostles? Which one has that unbroken connection all the way back?
It's about the history then.
Oh, absolutely. Big time. The author is very much convinced that, human nature is basically timeless, right? So the struggles and questions people faced like centuries ago are still relevant to us today. So if you really want to find the purest form of Christianity, you got to go back to the source, back to those who were closest to the time of Christ and the apostles.
And that's where they kind of lay down a challenge to Protestantism, especially, because their argument is since Protestantism came about in response to Catholicism, it kind of struggles to establish its own independent history. You know what I mean?
It's like they were saying you can't just define yourself by what you're against. You need a solid foundation of your own. And for this author, that foundation is rooted in the historical continuity of the Orthodox Church.
Okay, so they dig deeper into all the different, flavors of Protestant thought, too. They make a distinction between what they call, quote, radical Protestants, like the Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right, those who believe there was a complete falling away from the true church at some point.
And then there are the liturgical Protestants, like the Anglicans and Lutherans, who see themselves more as reformers of a Catholic Church that they believe went off track.
But even then, the author raises an eyebrow, because ultimately they argue that both these groups, they still trace their roots back to Rome, right? So they're still missing that independent line all the way back to the early church.
It's like you can try to reform, you can try to redefine yourself, but you can't entirely escape your origins, right?
And there's this almost ironic twist they point out. They say a lot of these modern liturgical Protestant churches, they're actually embracing modern trends even more readily than Catholicism these days.
Which, I mean, come on, it makes you wonder if those original criticisms of Rome, do they even, hold up anymore? It's a good point.
Exactly. Okay, now let's shift gears a bit because the author also spent some time talking about the Oriental Orthodox Church. And just so folks know, this is actually the third largest Christian communion out there.
Oh, that's right. And their story is pretty fascinating. Essentially, they split from the early church way back in 451 AD, all because of a theological disagreement about the nature of Christ.
Yeah, just goes to show you how powerful these theological debates can be, right? How they
Yeah.
can shape the course of history. But for this author, the takeaway is clear. Any separation, even if it's just over seemingly, small doctrinal points,
Mm.
it still represents a break from the one true church.
So even a tiny crack in the unity, it's a big deal for them.
A big deal, yep. And here's something I thought was kind of interesting. They actually point out that, the Oriental Orthodox churches, they actually function in a way that Catholics wrongly accuse Orthodoxy of being.
Yeah.
They're basically a bunch of autonomous, ethnically based churches.
Yeah, so there's a bit of historical mirror imaging going on there. Okay, so let's switch gears again and talk about the Syrian Church of the East. Now, this was a vibrant church, really spanned from Persia all the way to China, and they actually got their independence from Rome due to political pressure, which is kind of cool.
Sounds like a pretty clean break, right?
Yeah.
Like both sides just acknowledging each other as valid churches.
Yeah, I thought so too, but of course there's a twist. There's always a twist.
Right. Because later on, the Assyrian church went and adopted Nestorianism.
Yeah.
That's a theological viewpoint that, well, it's generally considered heretical. And sadly, you know, eventually they kind of went into decline.
So at first glance, it seems like this would support the Catholic argument that unity under Rome is, like, essential. But it also makes you think, did their decline happen solely because of that shift in theology? Or were there other things going on? And how does this example affect the way we judge, the legitimacy of other groups that have split off? It's a real head scratcher.
Those are some great questions. And speaking of judging legitimacy, maybe this is a good place to uh, transition into talking about how the author views Catholicism itself. Because despite all the critique we've been discussing, they do give credit where credit is due.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. They fully acknowledge that Catholicism has a strong claim to apostolic origin.
Yeah.
And they recognize its role in, preserving a lot of those early church teachings. They even acknowledge the initial validity of that Assyrian church separation.
Right. But there's a but. They also see some, I guess you could say, pretty significant internal contradictions within Catholicism. And those contradictions, they argue, kind of undermine the whole claim of infallibility.
Yeah, that's a big one for them. And they get specific, too. They bring up this thing called the La Salette apparition. It supposedly predicts that Rome itself will become, wait for it, the seat of the Antichrist.
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. They delve into other examples of what they see as like inconsistencies and changes in Catholic doctrine throughout history.
Ooh, this is getting good. And this, my friends, is exactly where we're going to pick things up in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to explore how the author contrasts these Catholic complexities with Orthodoxy, and especially with this whole concept of economia.
It's a fascinating discussion for sure. We'll see how this idea of economia offers a different way of thinking about unity, flexibility, and how we apply these ancient teachings in a world that, well, never stops changing.
Welcome back, everybody. We're picking up right where we left off, diving deeper into why Orthodoxy and how the author views Catholicism. It's an interesting mix, right?
Like, yeah, definitely. It's like they respect Catholicism's history, its traditions, but then they also have some pretty strong criticisms about whether it's really, as consistent as it claims to be.
And the big one, the one they keep coming back to, is this whole idea of infallibility, right? The Catholic Church says it's infallible, but they also keeps finding all these examples throughout history where, well, it seems like doctrines have kind of changed.
Exactly. Like, take the Immaculate Conception. That wasn't officially declared dogma until, like, the 19th century. So for centuries before that, perfectly faithful Catholics could believe something different, and it wasn't a problem.
It's almost like those earlier Catholics, some of them even, like big-time church fathers, were kind of like retroactively condemned by that later declaration.
That's exactly the point the author's making. If the church is truly infallible, how can it change its stance on such a fundamental doctrine? Makes you wonder, right? What's stopping them from changing other doctrines down the line?
Yeah, it's like the rug could be pulled out from under you at any moment, right? And they also bring up, like, the changing stance on the death penalty. For most of Catholic history, it was okay, and now it's condemned. So which is it?
And the author points out that this creates a real dilemma for Catholics. Like, do you align yourself with, the current pope or with the way the church is taught for, centuries? It's a tough one.
It is. And then there's this whole thing about anti-popes, too. If a pope is later declared, a heretic, it's like their entire papacy just gets erased, like they were never the legitimate leader in the first place.
The author sees this as a huge problem for anyone who thinks Catholicism is like the ultimate source of certainty. How can you be sure the pope you're following is, actually valid? What if he gets declared an anti-pope like 50 years from now?
You're constantly looking over your shoulder. It creates a sense of like instability, almost a lack of, solid ground. And this is where the author really contrasts it with that Orthodox idea of economia, which we talked about a little bit before.
Economia. This is a big one, for sure. It provides a way for, flexibility and adaptation within Orthodoxy. It's not about changing core doctrines, but more about figuring out how to live them out in different contexts, different cultures.
So it's not about, rigid rules. It's more about, I don't know, maybe, organic growth or something, like a tree that stays rooted, but its branches grow out in different directions.
That's such a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The author definitely sees this as a strength, right? Like, it lets Orthodoxy evolve without, abandoning its ancient traditions.
And it helps them avoid those doctrinal, I don't know, those doctrinal rigidities and like the retroactive condemnations that they see happening in Catholicism.
Totally. And the author even uses their own personal practice with the calendar as an example. Like they go to a church that follows the new calendar, but personally at home, they still follow the old calendar for, private devotions and stuff.
So they're like finding a way to honor both tradition and, the unity of the church at the same time.
It's a great example of how, like, an Orthodox Christian can navigate these internal differences without, breaking away from the community. It's about balance, I guess you could say, between personal conviction and communal harmony.
It highlights a key difference, I think, between the two. Orthodoxy with economia, it seems to have more space for like individual expression, different interpretations within that shared tradition, right? Whereas Catholicism, I don't know, it feels more top down, maybe.
That's a really good observation. But even with this like positive view of orthodoxy, the author doesn't pretend everything is perfect.
Hmm.
Like they do express concern about, the influence of modernism on orthodox thought and practice.
Right, like they worry that orthodoxy could drift away from its, traditional roots, kind of get swept up in the times.
It's a valid concern for sure. How do you stay true to your ancient faith while also, engaging with the complexities of the modern world? That's a question facing pretty much every religion these days.
It is, but even with those anxieties, it seems like in the end the author is still hopeful about the future of orthodoxy.
Definitely. They seem to believe that the church has like a built-in capacity to self-correct, to resist those outside pressures, to stay true to its essence. They see it as a beacon of hope, basically,
Mm.
a guide in a world that often feels, I don't know, kind of lost.
Speaking of guides, things get they get pretty intense, I think, when the author starts talking about like the salvation of people who aren't Orthodox, other Christians.
Ah, yes. This is where things get really interesting and, potentially divisive. Because they very much believe that the fullness of God's grace, it resides within the Orthodox Church.
So are they saying that like being outside of that puts you at a spiritual disadvantage, or
That does seem to be their position, but they're also careful to say, look, God's ways aren't our ways,
yeah.
right? So they ultimately leave the question of, who's in and who's out. They leave that to God. They acknowledge that, like, human understanding only goes so far.
So it's like a nuanced perspective then. It's acknowledging the importance of the church, but also recognizing, I don't know, the bigness of God's mercy, the mystery of divine judgment, all that. Like it's not up to us to draw definitive lines.
Exactly. And they also talk a lot about, the importance of evangelism, even to other Christians who are outside the Orthodox fold. They see it as a duty, to share the truth of orthodoxy with everyone, trusting that God can work through us.
It's about offering a path, not like dictating a destination. Makes sense. Okay, so before we wrap up this part, can we circle back to the old believers and the true Orthodox, those groups that like split off from the main Orthodox Church?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Those are interesting cases, for sure. And remember, they broke away over, disagreements about like liturgical practices, and some of them saw like modernism as a real threat. And, the author actually expresses some sympathy for their concerns.
They get it, right? That desire to like hold on to tradition, especially when the world feels like it's changing so fast around you.
Totally. But they also maintain that the World Orthodox Church, despite its flaws, it's still the true church. These schisms, even if they're understandable, they don't like invalidate the grace and authority of the larger body.
It's a reminder that, unity doesn't have to mean like total uniformity, right? There's room for different expressions within a shared faith.
And figuring out how to navigate that tension between unity and diversity, that's an ongoing challenge for any religious tradition, really, especially one that's as old and complex as Orthodoxy. It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. We have covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've explored the author's, critique of Catholicism, their defense of economia, their hopeful but realistic view of the future of Orthodoxy.
And don't forget about that discussion of, salvation for non-Orthodox Christians. That was a big one for sure. It definitely raises some important questions about, the nature of grace, the role of the church, and how limited our human understanding is when it comes to those big divine mysteries.
Absolutely. And in our final part, we're going to pull together all the key takeaways from this fascinating document and leave you with some final thoughts to, I don't know, chew on as you continue to explore Orthodoxy on your own. And we're back. For the grand finale of our Why Orthodoxy deep dive, it's been quite a journey, wouldn't you say?
It really has. We've followed the author through like all these twists and turns of their personal journey, exploring why they're convinced that the Orthodox Church is, well, the real deal. The one true church founded by Christ.
Yeah, we've been all over the place. I mean, we started with the author being super upfront about orthodoxies, like internal struggles,
Yeah.
right? And then we dove into their take on Protestant and Catholic theology. I mean, it's been a whirlwind.
Don't forget those side trips into like the Oriental Orthodox and the Assyrian Church too.
Oh, yeah, those were fascinating. It's like every time we turn a corner, we bump into these really big questions, like what does it even mean to be a true Christian? How much do doctrinal differences really matter? How do you balance like holding on to tradition, but also, living in the modern world?
Big questions indeed. And I feel like, for this author, a lot of it boils down to their strong emphasis on history and tradition. It's like for them, that's the key.
Yeah. They're basically saying, look, if you want to understand Christianity, you got to understand where it came from. Like, you can't just pick up the Bible and, like, interpret it in a vacuum, right?
Exactly. You have to look at how the faith has been lived and interpreted throughout history. And they see this, like, direct line, right? From the apostles to the early church fathers and all the way through to the Orthodox Church today.
That unbroken chain. And that's, like, the foundation of their whole argument. But it's not just, blindly following the past, is it? I mean, they're honest about the fact that, like, church history is messy, right? There have been schisms and disagreements, and let's face it, people mess up sometimes.
Yeah, they're not sugarcoating anything.
Yeah.
They recognize that the church is made up of, well, humans, but they don't believe those imperfections like take away from the core truth and grace that they see flowing through the Orthodox Church.
And that's where that idea of economia comes in, right? That's the thing that gives the church the flexibility to adapt, to like apply its teachings in all these different contexts without, changing the fundamental stuff.
Exactly. Economy is all about balance,
Oh.
about finding that sweet spot between like holding on to the core and also, allowing for diversity and organic growth. Like that tree analogy we were talking about before. The roots stay put, but the branches, they got to reach out in different directions to thrive.
I love that analogy. It really, I don't know, it captures something essential about what the author is trying to say. Orthodoxy isn't about like being rigid or blindly obedient. It's about this living faith that's like ancient and relevant, It embraces both continuity and change.
And that tension, that dance between continuity and change, I think is what leads us to that final, really thought-provoking question the author leaves us with. Like, if history and tradition are so important, how do we balance them with, more modern ways of looking at faith?
That's a question that could keep us talking for hours. It's about, like, how do we bring faith and reason together, right?
Mhm.
How do we navigate this ever-changing world of ideas and knowledge and still hold on to, what's true and meaningful? Where's the line between honoring the past and embracing the possibilities of the present? I don't know. It's a tough one.
It really is. But that's also what makes this whole exploration so fascinating. And I
Yeah.
think it's important to remember we've been looking at one person's journey towards the Orthodox faith,
Yeah.
and it's not supposed to be like the definitive answer to the why Orthodoxy question. It's more of an invitation, right, to grapple with these big questions, to
Yeah.
explore them for ourselves.
Exactly. It's given us this glimpse into a world of faith that's, well, it's ancient, but it's still alive. It's a world that values tradition without, being trapped by it. And ultimately, I think that's the message we want to leave you with. Don't stop asking questions, keep seeking, and keep those conversations about faith going. Who knows where they might lead you?